Good afternoon. We'll go ahead and call to order the regular meeting of the City of Murfreesboro Board of Zoning Appeals for August 26, 2009. We will just jump right in here with new business under variance requests. We have our first application is Z09053 by Ms. Margot Chapman for Crown Castle USA, requesting a 25-foot variance of the minimum required 32-foot rear setback for an existing 120-foot telephone transmission tower in a residential multifamily RM16 zone. This is for property located at 1134 Old Las Casas Road. The applicant is also requesting a 23.3-foot variance of the minimum required 25-foot rear setback for accessory structures on the same property. And Mr. Blomley, if you would review that application for us, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good afternoon, Chairman Rogers and all the members of the Board of Zoning Appeals. As you mentioned, our first item today is at 1134 Old Las Casas Road. It's the site of an existing cell tower that was originally developed by Sprint back in 2001, and Crown Castle, the applicant, has since taken ownership of that tower. You'll recall back this spring, Crown Castle made application on behalf of Cricket to amend their 2001 special use permit and height variance for an increase in the height of the tower. At that meeting, after the public hearing, it was brought to light that there were a number of violations on the site in conjunction with the existing commercial building and commercial development that's on that site. And after a little bit further research, it was determined that the tower itself and some of the elements of the 2001 special use permit of the tower were also in violation of the of its approval. So, and in the interim, I have to say that I commend Ms. Chapman and Mr. Scobie with Crown Castle. They have worked very diligently, along with Mr. Stroop, because some of the violations were relative to the commercial development that Mr. Stroop has there. But Ms. Chapman and Mr. Scobie have worked very diligently in attempting to bring the site into compliance as best they can. And I'll kind of go over with you how this has evolved and how they've gotten to this point right now. First of all, I'll show you on the overhead the site itself. Here's Mr. Stroop's commercial building, parking lot in front. It's right on the corner of Old Las Casas and Brown Drive. This is the parking lot to the rear, and the cell phone tower is back in the southeast corner of the property. You'll recall one of the violations that Mr. Stroop's property had on it for several years, based on the orthophotography that we've had, shows that for a number of years he had been parking vehicles on the grass landscape yard at the rear of his site, as well as within recent months had actually gravelled some of that in, which is a non-compliant travel surface, and was storing some construction materials and equipment back there in association with his apartment management business, some of his maintenance equipment. Since that time, he has submitted a site plan that's been approved, and the site plan showed the expansion of his parking lot with a compliant hard dustless surface, as well as required landscaping along that rear property line. In addition to the violations that Mr. Stroop had on his property, it was also determined that the tower site, there were several violations there as well. First and foremost, and this was discussed at the last Board of Zoning Appeals meeting in which this tower was the subject of, was that one of the antenna that was on the tower was not flush mounted. And that was how it was approved, or how it was submitted and approved back in 2001, that the antenna would be flush mounted, and one of the antennas was not flush mounted. Since then, Crown Castle has gone through and worked with the carrier whose antenna that was, which is T-Mobile, and they have changed out that antenna from a boom mounted antenna to a flush mounted antenna, and now the tower itself is now in compliance with the 2001 special use permit approval. In addition, it was noted that the landscape buffer that was required as a condition of the 2001 approval was actually outside of the leased area. It was actually partially on property that Mr. Stroop since sold to Dr. Agarwal, who has developed the apartment complex next door to the east, and part of it was actually outside of the leased area on Mr. Stroop's property, but outside of Crown Castle's lease area. And another thing was that the Board of Zoning Appeals required a no greater than a 50-foot fall radius for the tower. And Mr. Stroop, in a letter that he sent to the Board of Zoning Appeals via Sprint, the original applicant stated that there would be nothing constructed, nothing built, no structures within that 50-foot fall radius. Well, obviously, with the subdivision of his land, as was brought to light in the hearing we had on this past spring, a good portion of the fall radius, the fall zone, was now under the control and ownership of another party. And so Crown Castle has worked with both Mr. Stroop and Dr. Agarwal to secure easements. And if this setback variance, which I'll detail in a moment, is approved, they'll record these easements. The easements essentially, the required landscaping would be within landscape easements on the Agarwal and Stroop property, and Crown Castle would have rights to maintain and use those easements for the purposes of landscaping. In addition, they're proposing a 50-foot no-build easement around the base of the tower. So for the full 50-foot fall zone radius, they would have a no-build easement with regards to structures. So no structures would be able to be built within the fall zone. And they have had a structural engineer submit a letter reconfirming that the fall zone of the tower is no greater than 50 feet. So the fall zone would be contained within that no-build easement. And all of this that they're trying to do as far as the no-build easement is attempting to meet the intent of the 2001 approval with regards to the tower itself. And you'll see here is the tower, and here is the actual rear property line. The landscape buffer on Dr. Agarwal's property is here. The landscape buffer outside of the leased area on the Stroop property is here. Both of those would be in easements. And the fall zone radius, you have exhibits in your agenda materials that show that 50-foot radius around the base of the tower. And those are some of that's one of the things that they've done to mitigate the effects of the setback variance that they're seeking. With the 120-foot height of the tower, a 32-foot rear setback is required off of this eastern property line. When Mr. Stroop subdivided the property and created a separate lot of record in which he later sold to Dr. Agarwal, created a setback violation with regards to that existing tower and those existing equipment cabinets, which are accessory to the tower. And so that tower and the cabinets are now in violation of their required setbacks. So they've requested a 25-foot variance of the minimum required 32-foot rear setback for the tower, as it's 7 feet off of that rear property line. And they've requested a 23.3-foot variance of the minimum required 25-foot rear setback for the existing accessory structures, and those are for the cabinets, one of which is as close as 1.7 feet to that property line. And what I'll do now, just for the board's information, this was taken on Monday. This is how the top of the tower looks now. One of the antennas in the center was that boom-mounted type antenna, and they've replaced it with a flush-mounted antenna. Incidentally, they've completely withdrawn their request for the amendment to the special use permit and the height variance to increase the size of the tower. And they've stated that if Cricket does co-locate on the tower, that it will go on the existing tower without any type of increase in height. They will just utilize what they have. And of course, you'll recall back in the spring when this was before the Board of Zoning Appeals, the board said that unless the site was in compliance with codes and zoning, that the board would not take action on it, and the board deferred at that meeting. And I wanted to show you a picture of the parking lot. This was the gravel area, and they now have 10 additional paved parking spaces that can be utilized, and all of the contracting materials or the maintenance materials are gone from that area now, and the site is now in compliance. And if the board approves this request, and of course each variance should be taken in separate motions, staff recommends the following conditions. The final draft of the respective no-build and landscape easements with the applicant and Mr. Stroop and Dr. Agarwal, respectively, must be approved by the City Legal Department and recorded in the Rutherford County Register of Deeds office. I would like to have Mr. Ives take one more look at them before they're recorded. He has looked at them, however, and finds them to be in good order. But of course, prior to recording, just for a belts and suspenders approach, it would be a good idea to have Mr. Ives look at them again. Number 2, the landscape buffer required by the BZA in 2001 must be properly maintained and quote-unquote beefed up where needed in order to comply with the board's original approval. The installation of the buffer will be subject to final review and approval of the city horticulturist, Ms. Holloway. Now, one thing I will mention about that required buffer is they have done some pruning and upkeep, and it looks much better. There are some areas that they need to beef up, particularly along the southern property line, or the southern side of the enclosure. And they've stated that they would prefer to do that in the early fall or in the fall when it's a better time of year to plant. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Ms. Chapman and Mr. Scobie, both from Crown Castle, are here, as is Mr. James Murphy, their attorney representing them. If you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley? All right, anyone present for the applicant wishing to come forward and address this application?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Jim Murphy with Bradley Arendt, Boat Cummings and Nashville on behalf of Crown Castle. Staff has done a good job of describing the situation. Just a couple of things I wanted to reinforce. The subdivision that created the setback problem that we're here on that necessitates these variances was not something that was initiated or known about by Crown. Crown found out after the fact when they came in to the board meeting to get the approval. And secondly, there's no other options that we have in our leased area. There's not any additional room to move the structures and the tower in order to be in compliance with setbacks. So from the standpoint of the compliance with your requirements, we meet the requirements of showing that there's no other option, that there really is an unusual condition, wasn't created by us, and we need a variance to be able to continue to utilize the property. So for that reason, we would request your variance, a grant of the 2 variances, and I'm happy to answer any other questions you might have.
All right, thank you, Mr. Murphy. Any questions for Mr. Murphy?
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, then at this time, we'll go ahead and declare or open the public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would please come forward to the podium, state your name, address, and any comments that you might have. All right, and seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions or motion. And again, as Mr. Blomley indicated, motions, so I guess we need 2 separate motions here dealing with 2 separate variance requests.
If there's no discussion, I'll make a motion that we approve the 25-foot variance, subject to the staff comments.
We have a motion and a second to approve the 25-foot variance request. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, that variance request has been granted. We'll move now to the request for the 23.3-foot variance request.
I'll make a motion that we grant that variance subject to staff comments.
I'll second.
I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, both those variance requests have been granted. Mr. Murphy, appreciate you all the hard work that you've done getting this site into compliance. It looks like the original reason you came here was withdrawn, but it did turn out to be a good thing to get this thing cleaned up.
Yeah, it was definitely a good thing to get it cleaned up, and the primary reason it was withdrawn is because of these issues with the adjoining property owner. We really can't go higher, so we're going to have to use the existing tower now. We've got the final versions of the easements. I think Mr. Scobie is going to sign them. Do you want us to deliver them to your office to look at? How do you want to go through that process? Because we'll record them just as quick as you tell us we can record them, because we're ready to go.
Mr. Murphy, if you could have them delivered to Mr. Ives' office.
Okay.
And, or you can have them delivered to my office. One way or the other, we'll both take a look at them.
And you want them fully executed before you see them, or?
Would you like them for?
We've got the landowner signatures. We just don't have Crown signature yet.
In order to expedite, let me suggest this. If you all go ahead and execute the documents, and then you can go to my office here in a minute, and my secretary will make a copy, and I'll keep, and then I'll take a look at it and give you a buzz. And if we could do that before they get recorded.
Yeah, we'll be glad to do that. So we can we'll get them executed, take them to your office, and leave you a copy, and then we'll
Very
have the originals. And as soon as you tell us they're good to go, we'll bring them down and have them recorded.
And I'll get back to you, Jim, right away.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dale.
All right, we will move on to the next application, then Z09054 by Mr. Carlos Hernandez for Rama de Roble LLC, requesting the following variances for property located along the north side of Robert Rose Drive, east of North Thompson Lane, in a light industrial zone, the Battlefield Protection Overlay District, and the Gateway Design Overlay District. First, a variance to the minimum requirement of 10 feet between buildings and parking. Second, a variance to the minimum requirement of 15 feet between parking and adjacent property. And third, a 1,685 square foot variance to the requirement that commercial developments of greater than 5 acres shall contain no less than 2,500 square feet of formal open space. All right, Mr. Blomley, if you would review that one for us, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. I tried to make the headings as long as possible today to keep you on your toes.
Yeah, good thinking.
Mr. Hernandez has brought this application before you today. It's for a new NTB, National Tire and Battery tire store located on Robert Rose Drive, directly adjacent to the Regions Bank. I'll show you the aerial photograph now. This is the pad site right here. It's actually the last undeveloped part of Phase 1 of the Oak Shopping Center. Here's the Regions Bank, and this is Jim and Nick's to the north of the subject property. Here's the parking lot for Phase 1 of the Oaks, with H.H. Gregg and Bed Bath & Beyond. This parcel is actually a part of the larger Phase 1 lot of the Oak Shopping Center. And there actually is a lot line here separating the Jim and Nick's parcel, which is a separate out parcel, from the pad site here where they want to build the NTB. And the fact that it's a part of the overall Oaks lot actually comes into play. Just going to show you a layout of the overall Oaks Shopping Center. Here's the area here. Phase 1, actually, the lot line is around this area right here, and Phase 2, which has still yet to be completed, is directly adjacent to Medical Center Parkway. Now to kind of zero in a little bit more on the actual development of that site. And subject property is, as I mentioned, is on the north side of Robert Rose Drive, just east of North Thompson Lane. The building would be a rectangular-shaped building, a little over 8,000 square feet. And the applicant has received initial design review from the Planning Commission and has proceeded to the Board of Zoning Appeals for these 3 variances. And final design review will be pending the outcome of the today's Board of Zoning Appeals meeting. But the Planning Commission, in its initial design review, did not find any problems in allowing the applicant to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals for these 3 variances. As you can see, the applicant is trying to retrofit a site that's been in existence since prior to our Gateway Design Overlay District regulations going into effect. Phase 1 of the Oaks was approved in January of 2003, and the Gateway Design Overlay District regulations went into effect in January of 2004. So the rest of the Oaks Shopping Center, of Phase 1 of the Oaks Shopping Center, predated the GDO regulations, and so now this last remaining building pad on Lot 1, Phase 1 of the Oaks, is now stuck trying to comply with the regulations that were not in existence when the rest of the site was developed. And the applicant is not seeking to subdivide this parcel off. Is looking to keep it as part of the, or subdivide this area off. He's looking to keep it as part of the overall Lot 1 of the Oaks Shopping Center. And that plays into, I'll go over the 3rd variance first. That plays into why he needs a variance for the formal open space. On commercial developments of greater than 5 acres, there's a minimum requirement of 2,500 square feet of formal open space. Formal open space is defined in our zoning ordinance, and I kind of put it in layman's terms. It would be an area of open space where like a formal gathering could take place. For example, benches, tables, chairs, seat walls, statues, something that's not just green area, but an area where people can actually, where there are some elements that people can actually take in and enjoy. Had they chosen to subdivide this 1.3 acre area off, they would not be required to comply with the formal open space requirements because it would be less than 5 acres. Because they are not choosing to subdivide it off, they're having to absorb the total 2,500 square foot minimum requirement on 1.36 acres, which 2,500 square feet on 1.36 acres is a lot, and that was intended more for larger sites as opposed to this smaller site. But because they are choosing not to subdivide that off, they're having to comply with that requirement for a much smaller site. They are proposing 815 square feet of formal open space, which is a significant amount for a 1.36 acre area. This is proposed to include a landscaped outdoor seating area along the driveway off Robert Rose Drive, and as a result, 1,685-foot variance is requested. This is the area here where they would have their formal open space. It would be a landscaped area with benches where folks can wait for their vehicles to be ready. And as you know, taking your car to a tire shop waiting is sometimes a necessity. The first variance, and I kind of went out of order there, is regarding the minimum space between building and parking. And this is very similar to the variance request that was made for the Firestone store that was approved on North Thompson Lane. Naturally, because of the type of business, they, at least on one side, they can't operate without having the parking lot directly abutting the building, as they'll have bay doors. And you'll see here, it is there's a hatch marked area here. This is the area where they need the variance from the parking lot to the bay doors on the rear of the building. And they're also requesting that variance on the west side of the building as well, in order to be able to push the building further west and have a greater amount of green area along the main entrance drive off Robert Rose Drive. This area here, which will include a storage area and the dumpster, will actually be fully enclosed with a facade wall facing Robert Rose Drive. So this area here in which they're requesting the variance will not actually be visible from Robert Rose Drive. Now, the final variance that they are requesting is regarding the minimum space between parking and adjacent property as it pertains to the common property line along where the subject property borders the Jim and Nick's property. To promote cross-access and shared parking, the plan for Jim and Nick's and the Oaks Original Shopping Center was approved with cross-access in between these lots. And Jim and Nick's has actually had a shared parking agreement approved by the planning department to allow some of its required parking, specifically this area back here. And you see the property line as it goes down here. So some of Jim and Nick's required parking is even on the Oaks parcel. So naturally, we want to be able to continue to have free-flowing cross-access between these lots. It keeps traffic off of the main arteries and allows traffic to flow in between all elements of this development, and keeping the vehicles off of Robert Rose Drive and Thompson Lane is preferable. Or keeping them off those main arteries is preferable. In the landscape yard, requiring that landscape yard and that separation would effectively close off that cross access. That being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Each variance should be taken in separate motions. If the board approves these variance requests, we recommend the following condition: that the Planning Commission must grant site plan approval and final design review approval for the proposed development. I'll be happy to answer any questions, and Mr. Hernandez is here if you have any questions for him.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley? What is this, the area between Robert Rose Drive and the building itself? Is that a drainage easement runs through there?
Yeah, it's actually a pretty deep ditch.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Blomley. Mr. Hernandez, is there anything you'd like to add to this application, sir?
I think Mr. Matthews has done a great job in explaining. If there are any questions, we have to answer. But we're happy to add.
All right, thank you. Any questions for Mr. Hernandez? All right, at this time, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions, questions, motion. Again, we're dealing with three separate variances, so if there is a motion, we'll address that to the request for the variance for the minimum requirement of 10 feet between buildings and parking.
Mr. Chairman, I move for approval of the 10-foot variance between building and parking, subject to staff comment.
Second.
All right, I have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion on that? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we'll move next to the variance request for the minimum requirement of 15 feet between parking and adjacent property.
I move for approval of the 15-foot variance.
Second.
All right, motion and a second. Is that subject to staff comments as well?
Yes.
Okay.
I move.
Have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, then we'll move now to the request for the 1,685 square foot variance to the requirement that commercial developments greater than 5 acres shall contain no less than 2,500 square feet of formal open space.
Chairman Rogers, I'll make a motion that we grant the variance subject to staff comments.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Mr. Hernandez, that application has been granted in its entirety. We appreciate you all coming in today. Thank you. All right, we will move now to application Z09055 by Pastor Myron Edmonds for Oaklands Park Seventh-day Adventist Church, requesting a variance to the requirement that parking areas for institutional group assembly uses may not be located in the required front yard. This is for property located at 648 Cortlandt Street, zone residential multifamily RM12. The applicant is also requesting an amendment to a special use permit originally approved on November 27, 2007, and subsequently amended on August 27, 2008, in order to construct an institutional group assembly use in a single-family RS-8 zone for property located at 711 North Manny Avenue. The proposed amendments include modifications to the original site plan in order to accommodate the development of adjacent property located at 648 Cortlandt Street for additional parking. All right, Mr. Blomley, get your work cut out for you there, if you would review that one for us.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Two separate requests, as you mentioned. And first of all, just as a little bit of to brief you on the history of this, as you are all aware, the Oaklands Park Seventh-day Adventist Church back in fall of 2007 was approved for a special use permit for an institutional group assembly use, a church on property located at 711 North Manny Avenue. That's the home to their current church, and they were looking to raise the current church and completely redevelop that site with a brand new church building. And they subsequently amended their special use permit on August 27, 2008, and had a front setback variance request issued at that time in order to push the building closer to Manny Avenue and to be able to meet the minimum requirements with regards to building orientation. Since that time, Pastor Edmonds and the church have put a contract on the property directly to the rear, or to the west of the subject property at 648 Cortlandt Street. And that property is zoned RM12, and they wish to develop that parcel with additional parking for the church. You'll recall one of the main concerns that both the planning staff and the Board of Zoning Appeals had with regards to when the special use permit was originally going through the Board of Zoning Appeals was that they were just meeting their bare minimum number of parking spaces. And Pastor Edmonds has stated numerous times that it was his desire to acquire some additional property in the area in order to help alleviate those parking concerns. And so he, as I mentioned, he has a contract on the property to the west at 648 Cortlandt. We'll show the overhead now. And as this property here currently contains a single-family home, and there's the existing church building there. The property along Cortlandt is zoned RM12, so they do not actually need a special use permit in order to construct the parking lot in an RM12 zoning district. They can build that parking lot as of right, as in multifamily zoning districts. No special use permit is required for institutional group assembly uses. But what they are before you today for is a variance for the parking to be allowed in the required front yard. You'll recall that we had a similar request with the East Main Church of Christ on East Vine Street. They had acquired some additional area for parking and sought to maximize the use of the space on that property and had requested a variance to allow parking in the required front yard. In zoning districts where institutional group assembly uses are permitted by right, the zoning ordinance states that parking cannot be located in the required front yard. In the RM12 zoning district, the required front yard is 30 feet. So they're requesting to go essentially 22 feet into that required front yard to their required 8-foot front planting yard. So they would have the 8-foot front planting yard along Cortlandt Street, and then it would go straight into the parking lot. Now I'll show you the site plan now. Here is the existing layout for the proposed church site on North Manny Avenue. This driveway as you come in, and this is the property here that they have acquired, or that they are proposing to acquire. They would connect the existing or the proposed parking lot on Cortlandt with the proposed parking lot off Manny, and they would be able to get approximately 20 to 25 parking spaces in this additional area here off Cortlandt. As I mentioned, the parking area, they can move forward with the development of that by right after site plan approval. but the board is not considering that as a special use permit. They're considering the request for a variance for the parking to be in the required front yard. The special use permit amendment that you have before you is simply in order to amend the special use permit, as there are some slight changes to the site layout in order to accommodate the connection between those two lots. In other words, previously the church had committed to a fence and a buffer along this property line between the church and 648 Cortlandt Street. Obviously, that's something that is no longer needed if the church owns that property and then does construct parking on it. So, and they're also slightly changing the size of some of the parking spaces on site as well. Essentially, the layout of the 711 North Manny Avenue property will remain the same. As a belts and suspenders approach, however, I thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and as a matter of kind of cleaning it up a little bit, presenting it to the board as a special use permit amendment, because the buffer and the fencing were part of the original approval, and by connecting these two properties, they'll be required to be re-subdivided, and combining those into one lot of record would negate the need for that fence and the buffer along that property line. Now, what they are proposing to do, and if we could put the site plan back up, they are proposing to extend the fence along both the north and south lot lines of 648 Cortlandt Street. And that is something that is not required. If they were to build this parking lot by right and not have parking in the required front yard, that is something that would not be required. There's an existing house here to the south, and to the north is actually just a vacant lot with a big garden in it. And so what staff recommended be done in addition to that would be the installation of a Type C buffer yard along the south lot line adjacent to this house right here. A buffer yard would not be, if they proceeded by right, that buffer yard would not be required, but can be required as a function of this approval, if the board so chooses. So they are essentially, it's an 8-foot planting yard, but they're essentially getting the equivalent of a Type C buffer in that 8-foot planting yard. And the applicant has stated that essentially by requesting this variance, they're trying to maximize the site, maximize the number of parking spaces. I believe it's about 5 or 6 parking spaces that would be lost if they were not able to go into that required front yard with their parking. Staff agrees that while this requirement is very appropriate, the requirement being the parking in the required front yard, in a more suburban setting, many of the smaller lots in and around the downtown area are self-limiting because of their size and shape. And the applicant also points out in his letter to the BZA that he is attempting to address the city's concerns about a practical shortage of parking, and that he is attempting to maximize the use of his property at 648 Cortlandt Street. Both the special use permit amendment and the variance request should be taken in separate motions. If the board approves the special use permit amendment request, staff recommends the following conditions. A re-subdivision plat combining these two lots into one lot of record must be recorded prior to the issuance of any permits. And the subject development must receive site plan approval from the Planning Commission or administrative site plan approval as determined by the planning director. If the board approves the variance request, staff recommends the following condition. The equivalent of a Type C buffer will be installed along the southern lot line to consist of an 8-foot planting yard and the proposed privacy fence. And the final landscape plan will be subject to the review and approval of the city horticulturist. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. And Mr. Aaron Lowe with Huddleston Steel Engineering is here to fill in for Pastor Edmonds, if you have any questions for him.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley?
Mr. Blomley, on the original special use permit, they met their parking requirements. It was just the bare minimum. Am I remembering that correctly?
That's correct. While from a technical standpoint they did meet the requirements, which for a church is one space for every 8 fixed or mobile seats in the main assembly area, they did not have any surplus parking. And while they met the minimum standards, we had concerns from a practical standpoint about there not being enough parking. Right. And so they understand that too. One thing that I will mention is that as a condition of the original special use permit, there was a requirement that there be no more than 256 seats in the sanctuary, the main meeting area, and they are not seeking to increase that at this time. 256 seats will remain as a condition of the original special use permit approval, and that will not change.
Mr. Blumley, what's the thought process of having the Type C buffer on one side and not the other, just out of curiosity?
Our thought process is that there is an existing house on that south side in very close proximity to the parking lot. As a way to help mitigate the effects of a parking lot directly adjacent to that house. The lot to the north is a fairly wide lot, and for all these years has never been developed with a single-family residence. Has been maintained, as far as I know, as a garden for a number of years.
How far down, Mr. Blumley, do they propose to bring this fence? I mean, how far down will that go toward Cortland?
They're proposing to bring it down as far to the property line as our traffic engineer will let them bring it, so that it doesn't inhibit traffic sight distance.
Okay. So they'll work with them on not bringing it down right to the street?
Yes.
You know, I know there are two variance requests within this application. I get the first one about parking in the front yard. The second one is an amendment to the now amended permit. In the proposed amendments, modifications to the original site plan, what are the amendments to the original site plan? Do they deal with the landscaping issue, taking out the landscaping as it was proposed originally between the two lots? Is there anything else?
Essentially that, and connecting the two lots with the driveway, and they're actually widening in order to meet the minimum parking requirements. They had their minimum width 8.5-foot parking spaces on there, and in certain areas they're actually widening those to 9 feet. So they're relatively minor changes.
Okay. And didn't this come to us originally, and there was an issue about it facing Manny Avenue, whether the front of it appeared to be the front of it and face Manny Avenue?
Yes, and that was actually they had their original special use permit approved, and that was actually one of the reasons why they came back to have it amended, and they were granted that front setback variance along Manny in order to help add some architectural design elements to help it have more of the feel of a front of a building along Manny Avenue. None of what was approved with regards to that proposed building is proposed to be changed here. Essentially, with the exception of along the property line that adjoins 711 North Manny with 648 Cortland, none of the rest of the site on 711 North Manny Avenue is proposed to be changed.
And I'm sorry if I missed it, are there any issues about the Manny Avenue overlay with regard to parking in the front yard?
It addresses buildings, and I looked in the Manny Avenue Comprehensive Plan. I don't know that it speaks directly to parking lots. With regards to developments, it recommends that parking be to the side and to the rear of buildings. In this case, the parking is to the rear of the building but it's a double frontage lot, and the fact that it's got frontage on Manny and Cortland. So in essence, it is in the rear, but at the same time, it's double frontage, so it's also in the front as well. If I'm making any sense.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Blomley?
No, I think they passed them Edmonds, and they've made a good decision, because that was one thing that the neighbors complained about. Well, they park on the side, and now they alleviated that by getting the parking I say the back, you say the front. To me, it's the back. You know, it's of man, it just looks like a really good move that they've done to do that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Mr. Lowe, is there anything you'd like to add to this application? Okay. All right, then at this time, we'll go ahead and declare the public hearing open. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions or motion. And if we're dealing with motions, we'll take up the request for the variance to the requirement that parking areas for institutional group assembly uses may not be located in the required front yard.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we approve the variance.
Second.
All right, have a motion.
Of course, with the conditions of the staff.
I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, then we'll move next to the request for amendment to the special use permit, originally approved on November 27, 2007, and subsequently amended August 27, 2008, in order to construct an institutional group assembly use.
Mr. Chairman, I move for approval of the amended special use permit, subject to staff comments.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Mr. Lowe, that application has been granted in its entirety. Thank you for coming in. Okay, move now to our last application on today's agenda. It is application Z09056 by Mr. James D. Duncan, requesting a special use permit in order to construct an accessory apartment in a residential single-family RS-15 zone. And this is for property located at 2104 Riverbend Drive. The applicant is also requesting a 3.1-foot variance from the minimum required 40-foot front setback for the existing principal structure. And Mr. Blomley, if you'd review that one for us, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. The applicant initially came to staff and notified us that he has a contract on the property and wanted to construct an accessory apartment. In doing so, staff recommended that he get a survey of the property, which then led to the second request. So I'll kind of brief you on the special use permit request first, and then the variance request after that. The applicant, and I'll verify, he was supposed to have closed by yesterday and verified. Okay, they closed on the 11th, so he does now own the subject property. He would like to convert an existing sunroom into an accessory apartment. When the applicant first came into the planning department, he stated that there was a family friend that they would like to have living in a mother-in-law apartment, if you will, a close family friend. The planning director and I discussed Mr. Duncan's request, and we determined that while we could sympathize with the situation, under the letter of the law, our zoning ordinance allows only family members or invited guests. And by invited guests, we interpret that to mean short-term invited guests. I informed Mr. Duncan of that, and he understood, and he said that he would find alternative arrangements for the family friend, but that he still did want to move forward with the request for an accessory apartment under the terms and conditions of the zoning ordinance that state that it can't be rented out and that it can only be used for family members or short-term invited guests. And Mr. Duncan has, as you see in the literature that he has provided, has agreed to do that. He still wants to have it available for family members and friends as quarters for visiting family members and friends as they come to visit him and his family. He has submitted a survey of the property, floor plan of the accessory apartment, and a letter addressing sections 8 and 9 of the zoning ordinance. Right now, I'll show you really quickly the aerial photograph 2104 Riverbend Drive, located right on the corner of Riverbend and Shannon. And the driveway is actually off of Riverbend, and it faces Riverbend, and the accessory apartment will be right in this area behind the garage. It's the existing sunroom. Here's the floor plan for the proposed accessory apartment. As you can see by the calculations of the living area, it comes out to a total of 311 square feet, which meets the maximum 700 square foot requirement as outlined in our zoning ordinance. The accessory apartment would have access to the main house being over here where the calculations are, and the accessory apartment being here. There would be a laundry room, and both the accessory apartment and the main house would both be connected to that laundry room, and so both would have access to the garage, and the accessory apartment would actually not be shut off from the main house. It would all remain with ingress, egress throughout the both units. As you can see here, there's a small kitchen proposed, living area, and a full bathroom there. The application appears to meet all the criteria for accessory apartments specified in the zoning ordinance. As I mentioned, the applicant has provided the floor plan demonstrating that he meets the maximum square footage requirements. He's indicated in his letter that at no time will the accessory apartment be used as a rental unit to non-family members, and he has agreed in his submittal to record an addendum to his deed restricting the use of the accessory apartment as specified in the zoning ordinance. As you'll recall, that's customary for us to do with accessory apartments, to require as a condition of approval that that it be used only for the uses allowed in the standards in the zoning ordinance. The appearance of the principal structure will not change, as all work will be done under the existing roof. There's an existing door from the sunroom out to the deck, and this will continue to be utilized as the ingress and egress to and from the accessory apartment and to the outside after its conversion. After the conversion, the accessory apartment will continue to have access to the main house, as both are connected to the adjoining laundry room, as I showed you on the floor plan. Now, just to show you some photographs of the subject property. This is the front of the house as it faces Riverbend Drive. These three windows are actually where the existing sunroom is, which the applicant would like to convert into the accessory apartment. Here's the garage. So it's actually all pretty self-contained on the back side of the house. The appearance from the outside will not change. It will still look like a single-family residence. And the ingress and egress to the outside of the house is actually very difficult to see from the street and from the neighbor's property. As you can see, there's a little bit of an indentation in the house here, or a little open area in between the two wings of the house. And there's the door that actually leads from the sunroom, which is this area here, out to the deck. So I had to stand on my tippy toes to look over the 6-foot privacy fence to even see that door, which will be the ingress egress into the accessory apartment from the outside. Now, with regards to the second request, it is something that when the applicant filed his survey as a part of his application, staff actually picked up on the fact that the front of the house, as it faces Shannon Drive, of course, single-family lots with two road frontages are considered to have two front property lines and two side property lines, and as such have two corresponding front setbacks and two corresponding side setbacks. Well, as you can see on the survey that's been provided to you, that The house is only 36.9 feet away from the front property line along Shannon Drive. Now, the house was permitted in 1984 and built in 1985, right after our current zoning regulations went into effect. I'm not sure what the setback would have been prior to 1984, but from 1984 on, that 40-foot setback was in effect. As you can see on the photograph here, this is from the side of the house to Shannon Drive, and there's an escort right there. It's the obligatory escort shot for this meeting.
This is only half of it.
All right, and here is the survey of the property, and as you can see, the dimension 36.9 feet. So, as you know, especially those of you who are attorneys, sometimes setback violations can come up during closings and cause problems. So, when I noticed this, I thought it was a good idea to include and advertise as a part of this request, so that in the future this will not become an issue. The house has been sitting there since 1985 with this violation, and that's more of a, I feel redundant saying this, but a belts and suspenders approach. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them, and Mr. Duncan is in attendance today as well if you have any questions for him.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley? No questions about the escort, please. It's not for sale.
It will never be for sale.
All right. If there are no questions for Mr. Blomley, then Mr. Duncan, is there anything you'd like to add to this application?
Thank you, Mr. Blomley. Board members, I just wanted to expand on the family friend that I was going to have live there. He is a member of the family in all regards, as far as I'm concerned. I've known him all my life, and he's a 72-year-old blind man who lives on his own now, and I was doing all of his care and hospital trips and everything when I lived in Spring Hill. But I do understand, that the condition of not having somebody who is not a family member live in this accessory apartment. So I just wanted to assure you that I'm not going to try to skirt any regulation and secretively have him move in. That is not my intention here. The reason why I decided to go ahead with this is because of two reasons. One, I had already committed to the kitchen cabinetry before I learned of the condition. So that, coupled with the fact that my wife is English, we met while I was on tour with the Air Force in England, and her family comes over several times a year to visit. So with that, we thought, well, let's go ahead and do it because it would be great for her family visits as well. And with the second one, the setback variance, we weren't required to get a survey before buying the property or committing to the property. So when we did this and found this, it was unknown to me that condition existed. So those were the only 2 points I wanted to make. If any of you have any questions for me, I'll be glad to answer them.
All right, any questions for Mr. Duncan?
Sure, having a separate kitchen is no reflection on your mother-in-law when she comes into town.
All right, thank you, Mr.
Anything else?
Duncan.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I did want to add, I neglected to read the recommended condition that a deed restriction must be recorded stating that the accessory apartment will not be used for rental purposes and that it will comply with all of the standards specified in the zoning ordinance. Just wanted to get that on the record.
All right, then at this time, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward. All right, seeing none, I'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussions or motion.
Are we doing two?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'll make a motion that we approve the special use permit with respects to the apartment, accessory apartment,
I'll second.
with staff comments.
Staff comments, okay. Have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that portion of the application has been granted. We'll now turn to the request for the 3.1-foot variance from the minimum required 40-foot front setback.
Chairman, I'll move for approval of the 3.1-foot setback variance.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that application has been granted in its entirety, Mr. Duncan. Thank you very much for coming in. Appreciate you. All right. At this time, then, are there any next item on the agenda are staff reports and other business. Is there any staff reports or other business?
The only thing that I would like to mention is that you didn't have any minutes on your agenda today because Ms. Davis took a well-deserved vacation, and so we should have two sets of minutes for you to review at your next meeting. A lot of good reading for you. Other than that, I have nothing for you.
All right, we will eagerly await receipt of those. All right. Well, there being no other business to come before the board, then we are adjourned.